While the world was distracted by headlines and social media noise, something monumental happened that barely made the news. A single infrastructure project in the mountains of Tibet just redrew the map of global power. And the United States? It didn't even see it coming. The cameras were rolling when it happened. Scott Bessent, one of America's most senior Treasury officials, stood before the press and issued what can only be described as an ultimatum to the world. His words were sharp, deliberate, and carried the weight of Washington's full authority behind them. Any nation purchasing Russian oil through Chinese intermediaries would be hit with a staggering 100% punitive tariff. Not 50%, not 70, 100. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just aimed at Moscow or Beijing. The warning extended far beyond traditional adversaries. India was on the list. So was Germany. Even nations that have stood shoulder to shoulder with America for generations, members of the exclusive G7 club, were put on notice. The message was unmistakable. Fall in line with Washington's demands or prepare for economic pain. This is the new language of diplomacy in the 21st century. Trade has become weaponized. Alliances are being tested. And the United States is forcing countries worldwide to make an impossible choice: loyalty to American policy or survival in a multipolar economic landscape. It sounds almost dystopian when you say it out loud, but this is the world we're living in right now. Now, you might expect that China would respond with equally aggressive rhetoric. Perhaps a fiery statement from Beijing condemning American overreach, maybe threats of retaliation or diplomatic posturing at the United Nations. That's how these things usually play out, right? But China didn't play that game. Instead of words, Beijing answered with infrastructure. While American officials were drafting sanctions and preparing press conferences, something extraordinary was happening in the remote highlands of Tibet. 5 colossal hydroelectric facilities were activated, simultaneously brought online in a coordinated display of engineering prowess that stunned energy analysts worldwide. The numbers are almost difficult to comprehend. These plants now generate more than 300 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity annually. To put that in perspective, that's more power than the entire nation of Poland consumes in 12 months. One region of China is now producing electricity equivalent to a European country's total energy needs. And here's the kicker. When was the last time the United States completed a major national energy project of this scale? Not a private solar farm or a state-level initiative, but a truly transformative, nation-defining energy endeavor. You'd have to go back decades to find an answer. America has become a country that threatens rather than builds. It wields sanctions instead of innovation. The contrast couldn't be starker. Washington's strategy was predicated on a simple calculation: cut China off from Russian energy supplies, and Beijing would be forced to capitulate. Isolate them from oil and gas, and they'd have no choice but to accept American terms. It was economic strangulation disguised as policy. But that plan had a fatal flaw. It assumed China was vulnerable. It assumed dependence. It assumed Beijing hadn't been preparing for exactly this scenario for years. China's massive energy expansion didn't just undermine Washington's strategy, it made it completely irrelevant. Beijing isn't scrambling to secure foreign oil because it has no alternatives. It's constructing a domestic energy empire that operates beyond the reach of sanctions, tariffs, or diplomatic pressure. Hydroelectric power, solar arrays stretching across deserts, industrial-scale renewable installations. This is infrastructure that Washington cannot sanction, cannot block, cannot disrupt. The timing of these power plants coming online was no accident. In the high-stakes game of geopolitics, timing is everything. China was sending an unmistakable signal to Washington, to Brussels, to New Delhi, and to every capital watching. We control our energy future, and we will not be isolated. In one coordinated move, Beijing shattered the narrative that has dominated Western think tanks and policy papers for years. The story that China is fragile, that it's dependent on foreign energy, that economic pressure could force compliance. All of that crumbled the moment those turbines started spinning. But let's dig deeper into Beijing's tariff threat, because this isn't really about money. Tariffs are rarely just about economics. They're about influence, they're about leverage, they're about power. History shows us this pattern clearly. Even America's closest allies have found themselves on the receiving end of punitive trade measures. Canada, a neighbor and NATO partner, has faced heavy tariffs under multiple U.S. administrations. These weren't responses to security threats or ideological differences. They were tools of economic dominance, reminders of who sets the rules in North American trade. The current escalation follows a familiar script. Washington imposed 30% tariffs on a wide range of Chinese imports. Beijing retaliated with measures targeting American agricultural products and manufactured goods. Then the United States escalated again, this time proposing secondary tariffs of 100% against any nation purchasing Russian or Iranian oil. The strategy is transparent when you step back and look at the bigger picture. Cut China off from its energy suppliers. Turn oil into a weapon. Force Beijing into a corner where compliance is the only option. It's economic warfare dressed up as trade policy. In July of last year, Beijing traveled to Stockholm for what was publicly described as a negotiation with his Chinese counterpart. The meeting was framed as diplomatic outreach, a chance for dialogue between two economic superpowers. But anyone reading between the lines could see what was really happening. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum wrapped in diplomatic niceties. Comply with Washington's conditions or face the consequences. But here's where theory collides with reality. Tariffs might look effective on paper. They might generate government revenue or create short-term political wins for politicians who can claim they're being tough on China. But they're already inflicting serious damage on American businesses and consumers. The data tells a troubling story. Between May of 2024 and May of 2025, U.S. exports to China dropped by 18%. That's not a marginal decline. That's a collapse. It's the sharpest fall since the pandemic shutdowns devastated global trade. American companies that relied on the Chinese market are hemorrhaging revenue. Jobs are disappearing, supply chains are fracturing. And who pays the real cost? It's not Chinese manufacturers or Beijing's government officials. It's ordinary Americans walking into stores and seeing prices climb higher every month. It's families struggling with the rising cost of electronics, clothing, and household goods. Tariffs are a hidden tax that hurts the very people politicians claim to protect. Beijing's plan to extend these tariffs globally faces resistance from an unexpected source: reality itself. China was once heavily reliant on Russian and Iranian oil. That dependence was seen as a weakness, a pressure point Washington could exploit. But that was yesterday's China. Today's China is generating energy domestically at a scale that most Western analysts didn't think possible. Weaponizing energy access is a dangerous gamble. If China refuses to yield, and every indication suggests it will, the consequences ripple outward in ways that are difficult to predict. Global oil markets could destabilize, prices could spike, and nations around the world might accelerate efforts to create alternative systems that operate outside the dollar-dominated financial architecture. Pushing countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, and other BRICS nations into a corner carries enormous risks. These aren't small economies. Together, they represent billions of people and trillions in GDP. If Washington's pressure forces them to band together and build independent financial networks, the very global economic order that has ensured American dominance since World War II could begin to fracture. Ironically, a strategy designed to preserve U.S. hegemony might end up hastening its decline. Europe finds itself caught in an impossible position. European nations export over $130 billion in pharmaceuticals and metals to the United States annually. Add another 67 billion in automobiles and auto parts. These aren't trivial numbers. These are the foundations of European industrial economies. Brussels is facing a choice that no one wants to make. Give in to American pressure and risk alienating major trading partners like China, or stand firm and watch tariffs devastate key industries. Politicians in Berlin, Paris, and Rome are acutely aware that either path leads to economic pain and job losses. There are no good options, only difficult trade-offs. Meanwhile, China's response to Washington's threats has been more powerful than any speech, any sanction, or any warning could ever be. It built something. In July of last year, construction officially began on what may become the most significant infrastructure project of the 21st century. The Yarlung Changpo project, also known as the Maidong Hydropower Station, is rising in the mountainous terrain of Tibet. When completed, it will be the largest hydropower facility on Earth. This isn't just engineering, it's a declaration. It's China telling the world exactly where it stands and where it's headed. The scale is almost incomprehensible. When fully operational, this facility will generate approximately 300 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity every single year. That's triple the output of the Three Gorges Dam, which held the title of the world's largest power station for decades. It's enough energy to power a country the size of the United Kingdom from start to finish. While other nations are stuck in endless cycles of political debate, environmental reviews, and feasibility studies, China is pouring concrete and moving mountains, literally. The project comprises 5 massive dams connected by intricate tunnel systems carved through some of the most challenging terrain on the planet. The total cost is estimated at 1.22 trillion yuan, or roughly 168 billion US dollars. That's more than the GDP of many nations, and China is investing it into a single project. This is what separating looks like in the modern era. Washington issues threats and imposes sanctions. Beijing builds dams and generates electricity. One side talks about power, the other side creates it. The global balance of influence is shifting beneath our feet, and the implications for international economics, diplomacy, and American strategy are only beginning to emerge. The Yarlung Changpo Dam is expected to reach completion in the early 2030s. That might sound distant, but in infrastructure terms, it's remarkably fast. And here's the uncomfortable truth for Washington. The United States hasn't built anything remotely comparable in living memory. The last major dam constructed in America was finished generations ago. The Grand Coulee Dam, currently the largest in the United States, generates just 6 gigawatts of power. That's barely 10% of what China's new project will deliver when it's finished. Even with the massive infrastructure bills passed by Congress in recent years, bills that were celebrated as transformative investments in America's future, none of them include energy projects of this magnitude. This contrast reveals something profound about national priorities and capabilities. While the United States debates climate policy, argues over regulatory frameworks, and struggles to maintain existing infrastructure, China is actively reshaping its physical landscape. This is clean energy development at a scale that redefines what's possible. But this project is about far more than electricity generation. It's about influence, it's about control, and it's about sending a message to neighboring countries. The Yarlung Tsangpo River doesn't stop at China's borders. It flows southward into India, where it becomes the Brahmaputra, and eventually into Bangladesh. Hundreds of millions of people downstream depend on this water for agriculture, fishing, drinking, and daily survival. And now, China controls it. Officials in New Delhi and Dhaka are watching this project with deep unease. The fear isn't hypothetical. Control over the river could allow Beijing to manipulate water flow, impacting crops during crucial growing seasons. It could enable China to release water suddenly, causing catastrophic flooding in densely populated regions. Whether or not Beijing would actually weaponize the river is almost beside the point. The capability itself is a form of leverage. India has formally raised these concerns with China through diplomatic channels. The warnings have been clear. This dam could be used as a geopolitical tool, and downstream nations will not accept that risk without pushback. Chinese authorities have responded with assurances that the project is purely for domestic energy needs and poses no threat to neighbors. But words are cheap. Trust is earned, and the underlying anxiety remains. Water is the ultimate strategic resource. In a world facing climate change and increasing droughts, whoever controls water controls the future. And downstream nations understandably don't want their security dependent on Beijing's goodwill. While China builds with concrete and steel, America hesitates. Political leaders still proclaim that the United States is the indispensable nation, the leader of the free world, the primary global superpower. But when you look at transformative energy projects, when you examine infrastructure investment, when you measure tangible progress, the reality tells a very different story. This became starkly evident in June of 2025, during a crisis that, honestly, most people have already forgotten. Tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, reached a boiling point following U.S. and Israeli military strikes on Iranian targets. Tehran's parliament issued a threat that sent shockwaves through energy markets. They would blockade the strait. If Iran had followed through, global oil prices would have skyrocketed overnight. Economies from Tokyo to London would have felt the impact within days. Washington scrambled for solutions, running scenarios, convening emergency meetings, exploring military options. And then something remarkable happened. President Donald Trump personally reached out to China, not to condemn their Iranian oil purchases, not to demand compliance with sanctions, but to encourage Beijing to continue importing Iranian oil and even expand those purchases. Read that again. Just a few years earlier, American policy under multiple administrations had sought to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero. The goal was to strangle Tehran's economy and force regime change, or at least behavioral change. Now, in a moment of crisis, Washington was relying on China to stabilize global markets. China's response was quiet and efficient. It increased imports through smaller independent refineries, often called teapot refineries, bringing in more than 1.8 million barrels per day in June alone. The effect was immediate. Global oil prices dropped roughly 6% in a single trading day. Market leverage, not military force, had become the deciding factor. China stabilized the global energy system, while the United States could only watch and react. The shift in power was undeniable, and through all of this, construction on the dam continued without interruption. Warnings from Treasury officials like Scott Bessent meant nothing. Threats over oil purchases carried no weight. The dam itself proceeded on schedule. China had already figured out how to bypass American sanctions. Private shipping fleets operating under flags of convenience, smaller refineries that process oil outside the major international systems, and third-party networks that obscure transactions and make enforcement nearly impossible. All of these were now in play. Beijing understood a fundamental truth. America couldn't strike too hard without inflicting damage on its own economy. The United States found itself trapped in a paradox of its own making. It needed China to maintain global oil stability, but it couldn't stop the dam without severing economic ties that would hurt American companies and consumers. Threats became hollow. Leverage evaporated. Globally, the shift became impossible to ignore. Stock markets began reacting to Chinese infrastructure announcements and energy policy decisions with the same intensity they once reserved for Federal Reserve statements. Meanwhile, U.S. actions carried diminishing weight. Investors understood where real power was accumulating. This transformation isn't primarily about military strength. America still outspends every other nation on defense by a massive margin. The Pentagon's budget dwarfs China's military expenditure. But here's the thing: aircraft carriers don't build dams. Stealth bombers don't generate sustainable energy. Nuclear submarines don't alter rivers or stabilize markets. China is accomplishing all of these things simultaneously. It's constructing the future while others debate it. The Yarlung Changpo Dam represents something larger than Chinese ambition. It signals the emergence of a new world order, one where Beijing leads not through threats, but through tangible achievements. It demonstrates long-term strategic planning, the ability to mobilize resources at scale, and the willingness to undertake audacious projects that reshape geography and economics. The United States, meanwhile, appears trapped in nostalgia. Political rhetoric still references American exceptionalism and unmatched capabilities, but the gap between words and reality grows wider every year. While Washington talks about infrastructure, China builds it. While America threatens sanctions, Beijing creates alternatives. China's rise extends beyond economics. When Washington needed help diffusing tensions with Iran, it turned to Beijing. When the world required massive infrastructure investment to meet climate goals and energy demands, China was already decades into execution. The center of gravity in the global economy is no longer anchored in Washington. It's shifting eastward toward Beijing. Without bold American initiatives that match China's scale and ambition, the United States risks falling further behind. And the world is watching. Investors are watching. Allies are watching. Adversaries are watching. China is no longer the developing nation trying to catch up to Western standards. It has moved beyond that phase. In critical areas of infrastructure, renewable energy, and strategic planning, it's not catching up anymore. It's pulling ahead. The emergence of a new global superpower isn't a future possibility. It's happening right now in real time, measured in concrete poured and turbines spinning and megawatts generated. And America's era of uncontested dominance, the period from the end of World War II until now where Washington could dictate terms and expect compliance, that era is fading. What happens in the next decade will reshape international power structures, trade relationships, and diplomatic influence for generations. The choices made today in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and capitals worldwide will determine whether we move toward cooperation or confrontation, whether we build together or tear apart. The quiet shift is already underway. While headlines scream about tariffs and trade wars, the real story is being written in steel and stone on the mountains of Tibet. China isn't winning through force or threats. It's winning by building the world it wants to live in. And as those turbines spin and that power flows, one question echoes louder every day. What is America building? The answer to that question will define the rest of this century. If you found this eye-opening, share it with someone who still thinks the world works the way it did 20 years ago. Because ready or not, everything has changed.